It's the one right before the
Right.
This is my first one. I'll throw it in a time. Actually, this is probably one. Good. Oh, it's strong. What is weird? Dead. Bam. Bam, you're dead. Bam, okay. Wait, what did I do? You have to go back. Go to the back. Bam, you're dead. Bam, bam, bam. Oh, crap. Oh, snap. Restart, quit the game. Restart the game. I named mine Link because
So I told them that you were like Yoda. I did, but I mentioned that. It's like lots of great advice. It's like Yoda. See where we get from that. Oh yeah.
the prepaid takes a very long time.
You just think about quoting from the fan minutes. Star Wars approach your debate this morning.
I'll be able to use that as
Richard, add me again.
Star Wars.
Sure. My first philosophy class in college, I have to say it's very embarrassing because the textbook has a bunch of Star Wars.
Oh, I can put glass to it.
Yeah, no, the thing is, I have so many times thought about my teachers.
No, it's not. Well, you haven't done any of the
But it'd probably be worse to be in a place where they actually have Jordan had one of my favorites was Jordan had a class tabletop baseline. Yeah. Which was fun. It was fun for us because I played a lot of those. So we got to conversation about that. I think it's sort of create good connections. That's cool.
feels everything was like, I know everything was bad, still no.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah. Baseball is an interesting thing.
Did she play baseball?
Well, she played softball. So that sure it's softball. But, you know, I mean, that's everything.
In any case, he knows my wife is really late. They're going to need to have you been any games this year?
A couple of them. I had a good friend who was here.
Oh, wow.
It was very good. Never been. And I was at a great game that was a couple weeks ago. The night they had Black Heritage.
Much better, but super good.
Yeah, they still take some of it.
Yeah, I know.
You know,
I haven't had this song in my head for like months.
The Phillies are done.
right.
They don't have their cages. I don't watch them really have. They're young.
Right, yeah. A little untested, you know, more than anything thinking about at the beginning. I mean, yeah, they have the potential.
Yeah, it's on Facebook. I mean, I don't know the game too.
Yeah, no, they're right, yeah, that's their Yeah, we saw them opening day.
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, you know what, I'll take it.
Well, I grew up a Phillies fan back in the day. It was really so that was in my family.
Were you also on your
I mean, I've been here for whatever, so great. Just to go.
I had to go to the Red Sox for a little bit more. Yeah, it was baseball. I don't know. There's something about being at a baseball game that's very.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you so much again for all your time. I'll say it again in the next week.
Good. I hope.
You know they didn't have STDs in that period of time. So,
Well, good morning. My goodness, y'all are quiet. How is life in the dormitory? How's Dobbs Hall? You know, I've been working at this institute for about 30 years, and they've never given us that dorm. And it's a pretty cool little place, you know, right here in the middle of the campus. It's awesome. Y'all have done well, and they did it after they had renovated it and made it nice inside. It used to be a pit, and it's really nice now. So, congratulations, y'all did fortunate. All right. So we're going to talk about counterplans today, and this is sort of an overview of what counterplans are. I'm sure these are things you'll be talking about much more and much more in depth and with much more of a topical focus in your lab groups than you are here. But before I start talking about counterplans, I have a little trivia question for you all. And this should not be hard. Well, actually, it is going to be hard, to be honest with you. You are unlikely to know the answer to this question. But if you know a little bit about baseball or a little bit about Latin America, you might be able to answer the question. Who is that? This is a scouting report on a baseball player. Do you know who they are referring to?
What, Satchel Paige?
Nope. Good guess. Good guess. Latin America. What'd you say? Castro. Look at that. That's right. Dead on. And you, sir, have a winning gift. Well, look at that. It bounced away. Somebody's going to lose that.
Oh, it is Fidel.
It is Fidel Castro. That's right. He was scouted by the New York Yankees. They were not overly impressed, as you can tell, so they suggested that Fidel go into another business. He chose dictator for life. All right. So, before we start talking about the counterplans part, and this part will come up a little bit as we go along, I want to talk a little bit about one word that is always in every policy debate resolution. Can anybody tell me what that word is?
Substantial.
Not always. What? Should. Should. That's right. It should. Should is an important word for you all to understand because it impacts a lot of the debate parts. It assigns the affirmative the burden to prove that their plan is necessary to achieve the advantage. They have to prove that it is necessary. We should adopt this plan because we have to have this plan to solve the harm that we're talking about. Right? So it puts a burden on the affirmative, and so it's important for that. The second reason it is important about, the second thing it's important about is that it creates something that we call fiat. Anybody know what that word means? How about it? Go ahead. Yeah, oh, come on. You can, okay, back to it.
Fiat means let it be.
Sort of. Yes, that's close.
Like, you can't argue, well, we can't do this plan because, like, Congress will never allow it or something like that.
It prevents those arguments from happening, and that's a very important part of the concept. Yes, ma'am?
Something that's mandated to be should, or...
Close. You're close. Yes, sir. Let it be done is the Latin derivation. What does it mean in debate? Yes, sir.
Does it change the argument from should to could?
Not really. It doesn't change the argument, but it plays a role with the word should. Yes, ma'am. We debate under the assumption that the plan will be passed. It allows the judge to imagine what the world would look like if the plan were passed. Right? So it's a very, very important part of debate. Because otherwise, a lot of the arguments you all were talking about, Congress would never do this plan. Well, of course they wouldn't do it, because if they would do it, it would be done. We wouldn't have debate if we weren't allowed the access of fiat. The ability to take the word should and turn it into what would the world look like if this plan were passed. So it's an important part of the debate construct. And it becomes very, very important as we end up talking about counterplans. I want to add a couple things to this. There are other words that sort of establish the parameters for fiat that exist in the resolution. Okay? So the affirmative can't just fiat anything, right? They can't just walk in and say, I would love there to be world peace. That's a Miss Universe contest answer. That is not a debate argument, right? So you need to be able to realize that there are some constrictions on what fiat allows you to do. And in a debate resolution, they come from certain words in the topic. The first of these is usually the agent, which means in this topic, U.S. federal government, right? They're the ones who are going to act. So that's one restriction. The action, what is the action in the resolution? Increase, right? Substantially increase. Those restrict the range of what fiat could be. There are objects in the resolution that restrict the range, such as increase what? Economic engagement, engagement with other countries. That's another way. The affirmative has to do those things, and they are restricted to only doing those things. And last year it was, what was one of the objects? Transportation, infrastructure, right? So infrastructure modified somewhat by transportation, only that kind. This year, where can we do economic engagement? Not Latin America. Venezuela, Cuba, and Mexico, right? So all those things serve to restrict the range of fiat that the affirmative has in debate. Okay? So those things become important, and we'll talk about those as we go through this lecture a little bit, because they impact the way in which we conceptualize theories about counterplans. Not just the burden on the affirmative, but also what the affirmative is allowed to do compared to what the negative is allowed to do. So, The first thing is the purpose of the counterplan. What are the purposes of the counterplan? Twofold. One, to solve some or all of the affirmative advantage. That's what we generally think of a counterplan as. Or two, to make disadvantages unique. Not just to solve an advantage, they could be one of those two things. Either to solve the affirmative advantage or to make disadvantages unique. That's the purpose. So the second question we raise is, what kinds of counterplans are there? There are all kinds of them, because they are doing different functions in the debate. So I want to talk about 4 or 5 more as examples. This list would not be exhaustive. Your lab instructors might come up with other lists. Those of us who've been around debate for a long, long time probably see them more narrowly. Those who are engaged in the activity on a daily basis might generate a few more ideas of what counterplans should be. But I'm going to give you a list to give you some examples of what kinds of counterplans there are out there. First of all, and the most common form is probably the agent counterplan. We're going to use a different agent. You're going to use the federal government. We're going to use something else. We're going to use the Organization of American States and force them, the United States, to lift the embargo on Cuba. We are going to use other governments. We're going to have Cuba do it. We're just going to have Cuba force the United States to lift the embargo by blackmailing them. We are going to have states do it. Infrastructure last year, how many of you debated that topic? How many of you debated a state's counterplan on that topic? See? Another form of actor, a different agent, a different government agency. People will also run counterplans with alternative branches of the government. So if you have Congress lift the embargo, they'll go, ha! Gotcha now. We're going to have the president lift the embargo. And then we won't have big fights in Congress because we'll all go, oh my gosh, the president did it. We'll give up. Right? And then they'll run arguments about politics and why we don't link to the politics disadvantage because we had the president lift it by himself without having to go through Congress. Right? So people have different sub-actors within the government. Some people might have the courts do it. The courts should do it because that will avoid politics because they are not a political organization. And they have a constitutional duty to lift things that are unconstitutional, and we think the embargo is unconstitutional. We'll have the courts lift the embargo. Right? It's a different kind of agent. We'll have Congress lift it if you have the president do it, or if you have the courts do it, we'll have Congress do it. Right? These are all kinds of different alternative agents that you can use. Sometimes people do these things at departmental levels. We'll have the State Department and the Defense Department stop enforcing the embargo. Right? These are all different sorts of agents that you can use instead of whatever agent you use in the plan. That's what an agent counterplan does. So, if the Yankees had decided to sign Fidel Castro, and so we're debating a resolution, the Yankees should sign Fidel Castro to be a baseball player instead of a dictator for life. The negative counterplans by saying, no, the Yankees shouldn't do that because if they sign him, then he'll go to New York, he'll cause a revolution in New York, the state of New York will become communist, that would be terrible. Milwaukee should sign Fidel Castro. The Milwaukee Braves is where Fidel Castro should play because no one cares if Milwaukee goes socialist or communist or anything else. Nobody cares about Milwaukee. All right, so there are different sorts of agencies. There are different ways in which you can implement a counterplan through different government agencies. The second type of a counterplan is exemptions or exclusions. Exemptions or exclusions. You're going to lift the embargo to Cuba. Not us. We're going to lift all of the embargo except sugar. We will not lift the embargo on sugar because the sugar companies would be really mad at us if we lifted the embargo on sugar. They will not contribute to Obama's re-election if you lift the embargo on sugar. They will revolt in Florida and it will turn into a democratic state, and that would be terrible. So we are not going to lift the embargo on sugar. We'll lift the embargo on everything else except sugar. That will claim most of your advantage and will avoid the disadvantage that we have. Okay? Another form of a counterplan, exempt or exclude parts of the affirmative plan. The third counterplan, condition counterplans. Not conditional, condition. Condition the counterplan on people taking certain actions. So, for example, we will lift the embargo on Cuba if Cuba will do something that we want them to do. Open up the Hemingway Museum for the world to see. And if they will do that, then we will lift the embargo. And And they will say yes. Always in a critical part. And a condition counterplan is making sure the other country will say yes. Or they might say, we will lift the embargo on Cuba if Venezuela agrees that they will no longer demonize the United States. That might make Venezuela happy if we lift the embargo on Cuba, so they'll go for that. Right? So we'll condition it on that. We'll still get the benefits of the plan, and we'll get this great benefit from our counterplan that you don't get from the plan. Okay? So, you know, there's some more. You know, the Yankees will sign Fidel Castro if he promises not to have a revolution in Cuba. Then they will sign him to play baseball. All right. Consultation counterplans is a fourth type. We will consult with certain countries. We will consult with Cuba before we lift the embargo to make sure they really want us to lift the embargo. Because then we'll have better relations with them and we won't be acting as an arbitrary imperial power. We will make sure that they have input into this decision. And they need that. Or we will consult with the Organization of American States and make sure everybody agrees that the United States should lift the embargo to Cuba. And then they'll read evidence that says everybody wants us to lift the embargo to Cuba, so we get your plan, but we get to talk to the OAS first. And that is good. So these are sorts of counterplans that people can read that function in different ways. Finally, there are my final example, not the final and exhaustive list. There are many, many more types of counterplans, are advantage counterplans. Counterplans that are targeted at specific advantages of the affirmative. So, if, for example, you're running the Cuba affirmative with a soft power advantage and with an advantage on human rights, perhaps you can find some other way to achieve the soft power advantage, and you have disadvantages to the human rights part and disadvantages to this plan, so you will still solve the soft power part of the plan, but there will still be these other arguments that you can make. Okay, so you target specific advantages to counterplan out of those so that you can make other arguments in the debate. Yes, sir?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, an advantage counterplan is a counterplan that is designed to solve an advantage of the affirmative case, but not necessarily all of the advantages of the affirmative case. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just yet a fifth type. So there are all kinds of different types of counterplans that you can think about using. All right, so let's make sure I'm right about that. Yeah, there's a list for you. Okay. All right. All good? You got them? Different types, different purposes, different functions. All right. So, what are the benefits of running a counterplan? Why do people choose to do this? Yes, sir. It helps generate offense. In what way do you mean that?
It's not just you saying this is bad, you give an alternative which could be better.
Okay.
So therefore that creates therefore that makes it so people can't say, well, there's a problem now and they don't solve, so ours is the only option.
Right. Okay.
But you have a plan too, which means you also solve.
So you solve their case and you solve something else. Okay. All right. That's all true. And one final component of that. So let's put this together in a package. First of all, it solves the affirmative advantage. And secondly, it usually avoids a disadvantage that only the affirmative links to in the debate. And you will hear the word net benefit. The net benefit of the counterplan is that it solves the affirmative advantage, or some of it, but it avoids a disadvantage that is only going to occur if you vote affirmative. We avoid that disadvantage. And in the sort of strategic view of debate, the third component of this is that all of that adds up to shifting the ground to the negative. My debate coach in high school, over 35 years ago, yes, he is that old, said to me that whoever controls the ground of the debate is going to win the debate. The counterplan gives the negative maximum ability to control the ground of the debate because it allows them to assert in most cases that they are solving the affirmative advantage and generating some very unique disadvantage that only they can avoid with the counterplan. So it stacks the debate to the negative side very substantially. All right? 3 benefits. So before I get into some more specific things about the burdens of counterplans, I want to talk a little bit to you about uniqueness counterplans. Okay? All right, different sort of category. All these arguments sort of assume that we are talking about counterplans that try to solve for the affirmative case. But let's say that we're dealing with something different. We're talking about a disadvantage that you want to run against the affirmative, but you're having some uniqueness problems. Like, yes, we would like to run that soft power by the United States is bad. We think the United States needs to be a big, aggressive, nasty, hegemonic, militaristic power, beating up the world with its great military, and that's the way in which we can enforce world peace. Right? Let's just assume that, however absurd you might think that be. And the problem that you have, really, is that, Obama's sort of thought of as a sort of nice, soft sort of guy, not really as aggressive as some of the other presidents we've had lately. And, even though he's been doing some things that some people find like killing people with drones, that's just a few isolated, targeted killings here and there. He's not exactly out there, dropping the big bombs on people. That's not really his style. And so, and he's making nice with people around the world, and, the U.S. image has gone up in these years, so things are a little bit better than they were maybe, about 7 or 8 years ago. So the question is, how can you win a uniqueness debate like that? What can you do to win a uniqueness debate when you're going to be trying to say we need to be the tough guys on the block, and that's sort of hard to do. So you need to run a counterplan that puts uniqueness into the debate for you. And so we run counterplans that basically say we will do usually the opposite of what the affirmative is doing in order to secure a disadvantage. An example for this that might make a little bit more intuitive sense, right? You want to provide food assistance to starving people in Cuba. The problem is that they're getting a lot of assistance now. They really are, from different places around the world, from different places, so we really can't claim an advantage for that. So, that's really, really a hard thing to do. So, the negative says, well, every disadvantage I think about running to that is not going to be any good because they're getting food assistance anyway. Well, one way to do that is to enforce an embargo against other countries from providing food. Right? So that makes this disadvantage unique. It doesn't solve the affirmative advantage. In fact, it only magnifies the affirmative advantage, but it makes your disadvantage unique. Right? So you go the opposite direction. So this is the difference. Whoops, wait a minute. How did that happen? Well, maybe not. Yeah, see, this is why you don't do calculation. This is why you don't do these things. All right, there we go. No, let's skip it. All right. So uniqueness of the uniqueness counterplan is this. It doesn't solve the affirmative advantage. It makes disadvantage unique, and you still shift the ground of the debate to a strong negative point. Where the negative might be in trouble in uniqueness debates, a uniqueness counterplan allows them to make their disadvantages unique. So, those are the two different types of counterplans, essentially. We can either try to solve the affirmative or try to make our disadvantage unique. All right. So, yes?
Can you repeat the uniqueness counterplan?
Yes. The uniqueness counterplan it's designed to make a disadvantage unique. Right? So it usually goes in the opposite direction of the affirmative because it's trying to make a disadvantage to the affirmative unique rather than trying to solve for the affirmative advantage. So first, it doesn't solve the affirmative, unlike the advantage, the other counterplans that try to solve for the affirmative advantages. It makes disadvantages unique to the negative. It secures uniqueness for them by fiating it. And it still shifts the ground back to a strong point for the negative, which is we will now have uniqueness. We will control that through fiat, if not through evidence that our disadvantage is unique. Okay? All right. So the burdens of a counterplan. Next phase. What do you have to prove to win a counterplan? Advantages to it. And how do you go about doing that? What kinds of arguments do you have to make? Yes? Yep, that's something you have to prove. Anything else? How do you do that? Yeah. Right? That's the net benefit argument, that the harm to the absence of the counterplan is worse. Yes, ma'am. It has disads that the counterplan avoids. That's the way of doing that. Yes.
You need to prove that it's competitive with the plan.
All right. It has to be competitive with the plan, which means, what does that mean exactly?
It has to be better than any legitimate permutation.
Okay. All right. All right. We will get to that. Yes, sir.
It has to solve the problem.
It has to solve. It has to solve. Just like every other argument that you're making in a debate on the affirmative, they have to solve for their advantage. Seems reasonable to expect the negative to prove that the counterplan solves as well. Okay? All right, all these arguments, we will try to digest them and make them categorically clear. All right? First, yes, there has to be solvency. What does it have to solve for? It has to, if it's a counterplan that's designed to solve for the affirmative advantage, you have to prove that you solve the affirmative advantage, or at least as much of it as you need to win the debate. Secondly, you have to solve for whatever disadvantage you're avoiding. This counterplan does not link to this disadvantage. We avoid that, and we solve for this, right? So they have to solve for two things usually, which is the affirmative advantage that they're claiming to solve for, and avoiding the disadvantage that they claim to be linking exclusively to the affirmative. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
How does that work with the
Uniqueness
uniqueness counterplans?
counterplans have to prove that they solve for avoiding the disadvantage. The disadvantage is unique to the affirmative alone after the plan is passed, and that their counterplan is able to avoid that disadvantage. Okay? Make sense?
Yeah.
All right? So if you were to say soft power is a bad thing, then you would have to be able to prove that your counterplan avoids soft power. Right? Okay. So the third argument, it has to be competitive. All right? Simple concept is that it has to force a choice. The judge has to believe, when they're trying to resolve whether or not to vote for the counterplan, that they have to choose between the affirmative plan and the counterplan. The key phrase is a forced choice. The judge has to choose between the two. Now, there are, in classic debate counterplan theory, back to the days when Nick Miller would tell you that two guys named Tankersley and Klimchak invented the counterplan, which would be a lie. But if he were to tell you that, they would have said two things. Well, they might have even made up some other words too. But there would have been two. And I'm just going to talk to you about these briefly so that you have some concept for what's going on here. One of the arguments they would have made is that our counterplan is mutually exclusive of the affirmative plan. That is, you can only do the counterplan. You can't do the plan at the same time. It would be impossible. So, for example, if you were trying to make a uniqueness counterplan, you cannot both lift the Cuban embargo and keep the Cuban embargo. You can't do both. It would be impossible to do those two things. That would be mutually exclusive to do those two things. Pretty simple and straightforward sort of concept. It would be legally or somehow otherwise structurally impossible to do the two things together. That's one way to prove a counterplan is competitive. And it's very, very effective in uniqueness arguments usually, in the uniqueness counterplan debate. The second one, and the more common, and certainly the one that is more relevant to you, is what we would say that there is a net benefit to the counterplan. What this really means is that you should not try to do both of them. Because the disadvantage that we're running would link only to the affirmative. And if you did the plan and the counterplan together, the disadvantage would still happen. So the plan and only the plan links to the disadvantage, the counterplan, and only the counterplan avoids the disadvantage, you should do the counterplan alone. Okay? So you only do the counterplan alone. Alright? So with Castro, if you were going to sign him, he had to choose between either being a baseball player or a dictator for life. He couldn't do both. He wouldn't be a very good baseball player if you were trying to be a dictator, and he wouldn't be a very good dictator if he was trying to be a baseball player. Making all that money playing for the Yankees? No way would he be a good socialist. All right. So, burdens of the counterplan, they have to solve for the advantage of the act if it's a counterplan that's designed to do that, and for the net benefit that they're claiming from the counterplan itself. They have to avoid disadvantages to the counterplan, and they must be competitive and force the judge to choose between the plan and the counterplan, and those are arguments that become very complex. You will become more and more aware of those as your debate career progresses. So the counterplan is a great weapon. It shifts the ground. It allows the affirmative in most cases to co-opt the affirmative advantage. The negative can do that and win the debate, crushing the F. It's a great, great argument. Okay? It's a great strategy. It has become the default strategy in debate. When I was beginning debate, it was sort of like a rare thing that people counterplanned. But now it is assumed in almost every debate you will be in a varsity level debate, there will be a counterplan. In a straight policy debate anyway, there will almost always be a counterplan. Because it has such benefit for the negative. They control the ground so much better that way. A well-designed and well-thought-out affirmative has built-in answers to these arguments, and you're anticipating what a counterplan will be, and so you've structured your affirmative to avoid all kinds of counterplans and to steal some of the counterplan arguments. That's great. But I also want to talk to you a little bit about some general lines of argument that you can use to answer counterplans that you need to be aware of at all times. Okay? So, what are those arguments? What's the first argument you should make? Go ahead. What?
Permutation.
Okay, and what is that answer? Okay, all right. So let's sort of break that out a little bit. We'll build our way to the permutation, okay? Because I think you are correct, all right? The first argument, really, what you're making with the permutation is that there is no forced choice. You can do both of these things at the same time in some form or fashion. That is, you can still vote for the affirmative plan and achieve the benefits of the counterplan. How do you do that is sort of different ways that you can unfold that. First, you can just prove that it is possible. The second way to do that is to disprove the net benefit, make that argument not true. Then you don't have to choose between the two things. Those are ways of disproving that you don't even have to get to the word permutation.
What was the first one?
To just prove that it's possible to do both at the same time. Right? Now, a well-designed counterplan should be able to avoid most of these arguments, the first two arguments I give you, which is why we need permutations into debates, okay, and why they got introduced into debates. Because a well-designed counterplan, if you try to say, yes, Congress and the courts could both lift the embargo to Cuba, we could do them both, they will have a disadvantage to Congress doing it, where they will have a disadvantage to the courts doing it, built into the counterplan. That's why it's built that way. So yes, you could do both, but that would still link to the disadvantage. There would still be a net benefit to doing the counterplan alone. And that's what the negative's goal is. So that is where permutation started to really kick in, is how do we get around some of those kinds of arguments. So what is a permutation? You all keep throwing that word around. Tell me what that word means to you. Yes, ma'am?
It's something that tests the counterplans to see if it's competitive.
How does it, yeah, okay, that's you're being circular. How does it do that? Yes?
It's something that the negative does, and they say you can do both the counterplan and the regular plan still have to say or both.
Okay, and how does it do that? How do they do that? Yeah.
It's the combination of the entirety of the plan and all or part of the counterplan.
All right, that's a much clearer answer. It's some combination of the plan in its entirety and all or part of the counterplan. So sometimes it, yes, could be a permutation of doing both completely, which is really just a way of saying you could do them both at the same time. Or it is, we only need to do parts of this counterplan, which we can do, and that still solves for the problems with the counterplan that it's citing that the counterplan solves for. Right? So there are different ways in which you can combine it. Think what the word permutation means. It means taking different parts of things and putting them together. And usually we don't think the affirmative can sever out of parts of its own plan, so it's got to adopt the whole plan in its entirety, and parts of the counterplan that it thinks are crucial in order to make that plan and the permutation achieve the benefits of the counterplan, but not necessarily doing all of the counterplan together. The easiest way to illustrate this is to show that the plan can exist and you can add to that parts of the counterplan. If you can do that, we might call plan plus, the plan plus parts of the counterplan, it is somewhat easier to try to figure out how to make a permutation work. You will frequently hear the phrase, perm do both. which is really just saying we'll do the plan and the counterplan, all of them in their entirety. And if not, the affirmative has to spell out what parts of the counterplan it's doing. So perm, do the plan, and these parts of the counterplan. I should also give you a warning about a phrase that says perm, do the counterplan. And since a permutation means the plan to us and parts of the counterplan, first time I heard that argument made in a debate, I thought, oh, so you're saying do your plan plus parts of the counterplan. Or do your plan plus the counterplan. Perm, do the counterplan. At the end of the debate, when I said, I think you're still linking to the disadvantage, this just sounds like you're still adopting the plan, this team went off on me. They were so furious at me that I did not understand the phrase perm, do the counterplan meant we're just saying do the counterplan alone. We're getting rid of our whole plan. We're not defending our plan anymore. Why don't you know that? Because I thought the word permutation meant do the plan plus, but apparently I was wrong. And so you'll hear that phrase sometimes. These guys know because they hear this. This is an argument that has much more connotation than the phrase perm, do the counterplan. It literally means when a debater says that in a debate, be careful. Because what they are really telling to the judge, and if the judge is as foolish as they are in their understanding of the English language, they will say, perm, do the counterplan. That just means we're punting the plan out of the debate, and we're only defending the counterplan now. Okay? Just a word of warning, a word of caution. All right. So, permutations, well, I want to talk a little about those a little bit later, but that's an important part of answering counterclaim debates, to be able to prove a permutation works. Okay? We'll conclude a little bit more of that in a little bit. So that's one argument, probably the most important one to learn in a debate, in a counterclaim debate. How else can you disprove a counterclaim? What other arguments can you use against it? Yes, sir.
Disadvantages to the counterplan?
Disadvantages to the counterplan. The counterplan itself might be bad. Run some disadvantages, right? You can run them to the affirmative plan, run them to the counterplan. Yes, sir. Solvency deficits. The counterplan doesn't solve as much of the affirmative as the affirmative does, and then you try to leverage that against whatever disadvantage they might be winning with the counterplan. Yes, sir. No net benefit. They can't even solve for their net benefit. Prove that the net benefit still links to the counterplan. Yes, ma'am. You can turn it. Yes, you can. You can make arguments which I conceptually think of a turn as a disadvantage, and that is correct. That is another way of doing that, is to create an argument that says the disadvantage, we either solve it better with the plan, or the disadvantage is you can impact turn it and say it's actually a bad thing, or a good thing. Anything else? How about theory arguments? You got any of those out there?
Oh yeah, been like, say certain types of counterplans
Counterplans could be abusive. So let's talk about some of those arguments for a little bit, okay? The first cross-ex question when you hear a counterplan in a debate, what should it be?
What is the status?
What is the status of the counterplan? If you do not ask that question, you are going to be behind in the debate. First question from the first person doing a cross-ex of someone in a counterplan debate is what is the status of the counterplan? Now what that question should mean, if they don't understand your question, is the counterplan conditional, is it dispositional, or are you advocating it? Are you bound to defend the counterplan throughout the debate? That's the question you're trying to ask. Because people will make different arguments about counterplans. They will say, oh, the counterplan is conditional, which means that at the end of the debate, if you don't think it's a good idea, we don't have to defend it. If it's dispositional, they're saying, if you only make theory objections to the counterplan, we'll be able to kick out of that. If, however, you just run disadvantages to the counterplan, then we'll be forced to defend it. But you want to know the answers to those questions, and then you can raise theoretical objections to those kinds of arguments. What if they run two counterplans in the debate? Blow my mind now. Two counterplans. What do you do then? Yes, sir.
You could most likely argue that
That they might be competitive with each other. There might be a problem with why they might force you to contradict and even answer them both. That's very possible. So you need a bunch of arguments for these things, okay? So let's talk about what some of those are. There are arguments about why conditionality and dispositionality is bad, and arguments against multiple counterplans in the debate. I'm going to sort of go through a list of those arguments. These are things you will probably end up talking about in your lab groups at some point in time. Okay? But let's sort of go through what those are, just so that you know what they are and some questions you might want to ask your lab leaders about. First argument, your counterplan is a moving target. If you make the negative a moving target, we don't know what we're debating against. So you're going to defend the status quo, or you're going to defend your counterplan. Are you going to defend counterplan number 2 or counterplan number 3? What's going to happen in this debate? We don't know. We can't predict. So ground is unstable. Second argument, no stable advocacy. The negative has not taken a position in the debate. The affirmative takes a position in the 1AC. The negative has no position in the debate. We don't know and cannot predict where the debate will go. This is not fair to us. Third, it's an unfair advantage. It's unequal. The affirmative only gets one plan in the debate. The negative, if they are allowed to defend a counterplan and the status quo, or heaven forbid, the counterplan plus 3 other counterplans and the status quo, then that's really unfair to us, because we're confined to defending just the plan as written. The fourth argument that you might think about are time limits that exist in a debate, which restrict how many arguments you can make. If you only have the 2AC left, 8 minutes of debate to answer all of this counterplan in the debate, and then they could throw all of those arguments out in the debate, or most of them, just by saying, I'm sorry, you're right about these arguments. We're getting rid of all these conditional counterplans. We're going to defend the status quo. The embargo is good. Boom. And then all your arguments that you've made against the counterplan, the disads you ran, they all go away. That's not fair to you. Right? Time limits make it impossible for you to have control over this. And a final argument is this leads to very shallow, bad debate. You don't get to explore the issues in depth. They are confined to very, very narrow arguments, very, very short discussions. We don't get to have in-depth discussion about policy. So those are examples, 5 different sort of arguments that you can make about why there are theoretical problems happening in the debate with counterplans that, depending on how they run things. You want them again?
Yeah.
Moving target is that it's not predictable, because you don't know where the negative will go at the end of the debate. They could choose to kick out things later. All right? When you're making these kind of theory arguments, just to throw this at you, you need to think about theory arguments in terms of 2 kinds of impacts. Impact number 1 is fairness, that it's not fair to the affirmative for these kinds of arguments to be made in debate. Impact number 2 is the impact on education. We don't get valuable educational benefits. The brilliance of all our research has gone out the window because you've run so many counterplans. We don't get to discuss that. You could have such brilliant ideas if you would just take them in depth instead of getting scattered with all these stupid counterplans in the debate. So we don't get in-depth discussion of arguments. So the fairness and education are 2 ways to impact those sort of theory arguments. Okay? There are some other potential theoretical objections you can make. There is a set of arguments about something called plan-inclusive counterplans, or PICs. Have you heard of those? Anybody heard that phrase before? Right? Basically saying we're going to do the mandates of the plan, except for maybe a couple of them, means that they are really stealing affirmative ground. It's not fair to us for them to be able to do that. I don't think these are particularly strong or persuasive arguments for most judges, but you should at least be aware of them, especially if you're running a counterplan. People will say plan-inclusive counterplans are bad. They force the affirmative to argue against themselves. And a negative answer to that is very simply, you're forcing you to defend every word that you wrote into your plan. Right? And that's really what the debate's about. And so it's not necessarily a strong argument, but one that you should be aware of. Another theoretical argument that you can make that talks about a sort of different set of views and comes back to something we started this discussion with, which is the range of fiat. The range, the breadth of fiat that a negative might have in a debate. This is where we start realizing that counterplans are really a debater's construct. They're not something that derives from anything. We talked about how the affirmative's fiat range is both forced by the word should and constricted by the other words in the resolution that limits the range of fiat that they have in the debate. The negative has anything that's not the debate resolution, right? So they could theoretically, at the extreme, do anything they want. They could say, Cuba will love America from now on, embargo or not. There will never be any conflict, nothing to worry about. The world doesn't really care. We will just fiat that. You know, I mean, theoretically, there's no reason not to do that, you know, make those sorts of arguments. So we have to have some sort of construct that says that would not be fair, that would not lead to good debates, that would not be fair to the affirmative if you could do things like that. So we start setting ranges for what we might find to be reasonable levels of fiat for the negative to avoid debates like that, right? Because the negative has no resolution. They're doing everything that's not the resolution. And so we have to do that. Those constructs come from us in the debate community. We create those. You create those as debaters. You have control over this part of the debate. What is a reasonable range of fiat is a question to be resolved in a debate. There is no rule book. There is no resolution that sets grounds for fiat. These are things that you have to be ready, able, and understand in order to debate what would be reasonable grounds for fiat. So, to give you some examples of what kinds of things you're looking at here, would it be fair to have an international organization fiat the plan you're running? Free trade agreements with Mexico and Venezuela. Would it be fair to just have a super agency come in and say, all these countries will have a free trade agreement together? We will create a free trade region that's broad through this organization, the Organization of American States, or some other organization globally. Would that be a fair thing to do? I don't know that there's a clear or defined answer to that. But that's a debate you would have to have in a debate where that happened, or could choose to have if you were on the affirmative and somebody ran that against you, or be forced to have if you're on the negative and you ran that argument and people were saying, oh, that's not fair. You need to be ready to debate that. You need to be able to understand that fiat has to have some limits. What would those be? Are international organizations fair for the negative to be allowed to fiat through? Could the negative set up its own international organization and just fiat that into existence and have that govern the economic engagements between these three countries in the United States? Something that you would have to debate whether or not that's fair or not. Can you fiat that other countries will do certain things? Another question of a range of fiat. Is that fair? Does that lead to good debate? Is that possible? Is it something that we can have debates about? Those are arguments that you have to debate. There is no clear, defined answer. Right? It is the range of fiat that you can call into question and you can challenge that. Was it fair for states to set up their own Department of Transportation infrastructure projects last year and do all that in the high school topic last year? Is that a reasonable range of fiat? Could all 50 states act together and do exactly what the affirmative said to do? Is that a fair range of fiat? These are questions that you can raise in a debate. Okay, so the range of fiat is yet another theoretical objection you can make to a counterclaim. And speaking of fiat, the last argument, which I will only make you aware of, is whether or not fiat exists for the negative at all. There are some people out there who say the negative does not have fiat. There is no should not, is the classic way it's phrased. But the question of whether or not the negative has the ability to fiat a counterclaim into existence, since there is no resolution for that, is a question that some people have raised. I don't think most judges find it very persuasive, but again, if you're running a counterclaim, you need to be able to defend that the negative should have the right to fiat something too. Okay? So, answering the counterclaim. It's not competitive. The counterclaim doesn't solve, run disadvantages, it's a bad idea, or make theoretical objections. All right? So, the counterclaim is an awesome negative strategy. But the affirmative has a wide range of ways to approach it. If they win any one of these arguments, they could win the debate on those arguments alone. So every time the negative runs a counterclaim, they've yes shifted the ground, but they have also opened up options for the affirmative to debate. They've created 4 or 5 new arguments that the affirmative can make in the debate. Theoretical objections to the counterclaims are all based upon what's happening in the debate, what the range of arguments are. that exist for the affirmative depending upon the way the counterclaims are being presented in the debate. If it's not an abusive fiat counterclaim, that argument goes away. But if it's, if it is potentially a fiat abusive argument, then you can make that. You could always make the argument fiat doesn't exist. It gives you an option. And so instead of having, negative control of the ground, you now have 4 plus whatever theoretical arguments are available to you in your particular debate. 5, 6, maybe 7 arguments you can make against a counterclaim. So the affirmative now has some options going into the 1AR that the negative has to deal with in the negative block. All right? So I want to conclude a little bit of this talking about what a perm means, because we need to explore that a little bit before we wrap up. So somebody said it's a test. What did you mean by that?
That it makes sure that the counterclaim command and that the judge should never receive the plan.
Or the plan over the counterclaim, right? It's a permutation. It's the affirmative answer to the counterclaim. So what do you mean by the word test, though? What does that mean to you?
It's like testing whether the plan has that benefit itself.
All right. So if the affirmative wins this argument, I have a permutation and test the competition, what happens to the counterplan?
The counterplan doesn't compete with the app, so it's saying that the app is better solved than the counterplan.
Okay. And then what does the judge do with that information?
They vote that.
Do they vote for the plan and the counterplan together? Do they vote for the permutation, or do they just vote for the plan?
I don't know.
Okay, that's the question. That's the question that this very important point raises, which is, what does it mean to say a permutation is a test of competition? The question that it raises is whether or not an affirmative can ever claim to advocate the permutation, rather than just merely say, test of competition, the counterclaim goes away in the debate. Can the affirmative then use this permutation in the debate to create another advantage for themselves that comes out of the permutation to leverage against whatever other arguments the negative may be winning in the debate? Can they claim and advocate for the permutation? To be honest with you, I think most judges are going to say no, that you can't do that. But there might be some judges who accept it, and if a negative team doesn't answer this argument well, an affirmative team can use it in a debate to say, they still have a disadvantage that only links to us and doesn't link to the counterplan, so they could win that. But if we win the permutation, then we solve our advantage, plus we solve whatever other net benefit they claim. We will advocate the permutation, and we will then be able to outweigh whatever disadvantage they have left. So the negative usually is the one that, that is going to stand up and say the permutation is just a test of competition, the counterclaim goes away. The affirmative might sometimes want to say, no, it's more than a test, we get to advocate it now. That's our new advocacy. So that's another debate, theoretical, that debaters need to resolve. That is not, there's no rule book. There's no yes or no answer. It depends on the arguments you make in the debate. Another question about permutations that all of this raises is, can the affirmative sever part of its plan to create a permutation? Is that fair? Can they kick out a part of their plan to sever part of it, to create a permutation in the debate? It's a trivial part of their plan.
Not fair.
Not fair?
I mean, it's up to you in the debate to decide if it's fair or not.
Okay. Why is it not fair?
Because, they spend 8 minutes on what they see, and, you focus on how to, you make a strategy against their 1AC, and they say, never mind, not doing that, doing something else.
Right. Very, very reasonable. So the negative can make theory arguments against permutations. You can't sever would be one of them. Yes, sir.
But it's also the same as the negative. It's like we think it is that.
That Look at this, a theory debate taking place this morning at 11:20 in the morning in a lecture between two people who want to advocate opposite sides. How about that? Yes, this is what theory debates are all about. It is how you can leverage these kinds of arguments. Yes?
Wouldn't a separate firm basically be like just taking the burden off of the applicants would be?
Yes. Is it fair for them to be able to do that? Yes? All right, I'm not going to try to answer that question. You can discuss that with your brilliant lab leaders, who I'm sure will give you great insight. Fourth question. Can the affirmative offer multiple permutations in the debate?
Sure.
Yeah? Is it fair to the negative for them to have to answer multiple permutations in the debate? Yes, ma'am.
If the negative would have multiple counterclaims, the app do multiple permutations, like snapshots.
So what if the affirmative argues that multiple counterplans are bad? Can they still make multiple permutations in the debate? All right, y'all going to run counterplans? Y'all need to be thinking about this stuff. Because these are the arguments that frequently determine how these counterplan debates are resolved. And theory is not set in stone. It is dynamic. And it changes from debate to debate, from judge to judge, from team to team, from your personal competitive need at that particular 5-minute point in the debate versus your competitive need in another 5-minute point in the debate, whether you're affirmative or whether you're negative. Because it is something that you get to debate about. This is the coolest part about debate, and the coolest part about debating counterclaims, is that you all get to control this. This is your stuff. Most judges, better, more experienced judges, admittedly, are going to go, this is up to you, and this is what I think based on the arguments you made in the debate, and this is how I'm going to resolve these theoretical issues. You've got to make it clear to them, you've got to be able to defend them reasonably, but if you do that, the judge is probably going to listen to you. Because you have control over theory in the debates, and counterplans are frequently resolved based on theory. And they all come back to the same word, which started this discussion, which is what this should do. It sets up parameters for the affirmative, burdens on them to advocate certain things. It gives them the fiat capacity to imagine a world in which the plan would be passed based upon the restrictions of the resolution. And the negative gets to say, you haven't proven that the plan is necessary because we have a counterplan that will solve for all of your advantages, or some of your advantages, and still leave disadvantages that are unique to you alone. And so we're going to fiat to solve that ourselves. And you have not proven that we should do your plan. We have proven you should not, by proving we should do something else. All right? Any questions? All right. Bug your lab leaders. Get them to give you the answers.
Right?